Okay, well, first of all, my name is Jackie O'Reilly. I'm the president of Sussex, and I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Justin and Destin here today to talk about their new book. The idea of the salons is very much a way of enabling people who may not be able to attend the conference for a variety of reasons to have some connection with some of the debates we want to discuss. And you'll see on the website links to all the previous ones we've had that are related to the theme of the conference about fractious connections. So one of the ideas I wanted to look at the conference is about how people are connected together, but sometimes are not very happy about that relationship. And I think as many of us watching the investigations into the storming of the Capitol committees will recognize there's a lot of people, especially America and in our own country, Brexit, goodness gracious, about how we're not very happy hanging out together. So it's really trying to explore what these issues of connections are and where there is friction and fractiousness between them. And I was particularly interested, oh, by the way, everybody, it's being recorded. If you don't want to have your face shown, you can keep your camera off. Right, the reason that I wanted to invite Destin and Justin here today is because of their really important book, Histories of Racial Capitalism. And I'll keep the introductions really short because there's information on the website about, where they're based and what they're doing. I thought this is a really important contribution because at the Sussex community, we talk about a lot for a long time about different types of capitalism, about varieties of capitalism that are coordinated or uncoordinated or liberal or social democratic or fast capitalism or slow capitalism. But there has never been a discussion of racial capitalism. So I was just really wanted to put this on the agenda to say, one, why are we not talking about it? For those of us who don't know much about it. So I really wanted to use this opportunity for Destin and Justin to talk about their book, where they got to, and what we can learn from it. And I'm very pleased to have such a great and a wide audience here. Okay, so the way we want to run this session is briefly, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and they're going to talk about the book and things like that. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions you want to raise during the discussion, you can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand, etc. Right, okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And by the way, Destin is going to have a hard stop at 11 because he's got very important duties to attend to for his young baby who's waking up and needs feeding. So appreciate you very much taking the time to be here. Right, so, and thank you both of you to come. I'm really glad to have you here. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is about how did you get to the concept of racial capitalism? So where did you come from in your intellectual journey to end up here? Yeah.
Thank you again so much for having us. It's great to be here and have a chance to talk about the book with all of you. And I think for me, I was entering grad school around 2008. And in that period, there were two really important events that were shaping kind of how I was thinking about my own research on the histories and legacies of slavery. And the first was Barack Obama's election. And when I was walking from the subway in New York to my department, every newsstand had national magazine covers asking, is this the end of race? Does race still matter? And it seemed like this very kind of shallow understanding of race and racial inequality, whereby kind of race itself and inclusion could be a shorthand for broader forms of equality. And the second was the Occupy movement, which also, had its start in New York. And, I certainly don't think that movement was quite as unaware of racial issues as sometimes it's accused of being. But I do think there was a sense that kind of economic universalism would be a solution that could kind of help everyone presumably equally. So there were these two kind of dynamics, a sort of race first, ignoring the material basis for inequality, and then the kind of class first without thinking about race as central. And so kind of thinking about how those two things spoke or didn't speak to each other, and kind of the very important dynamics that we miss when we kind of think of them separately, kind of led me to thinking about racial capitalism and making it really central to my own research.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Good to see you. Good to see you, Jackie, and also Jacob. Thanks for the invitation, and to everyone here. Much like Justin, 2008 is a signal moment for me and the genesis really for my interest in racial capitalism as a framework. I will only add that the fallout of the financial crisis, not just the organizing against through Occupy Wall Street, was also a signal event. I mean, so we start to think about the erosion of Black wealth. We start to think about the deepening of the racial wealth gap. I remember at the time just trying to ask friends, like, how do we make sense of this financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers? Folks had very little to say that was convincing, that could help me make sense of the foreclosure crisis in my neighborhood, families with properties underwater, unemployment, and again, the sense that this seemed like a deeply racialized crisis at the same time that we were told that we were entering a post-racial America. So the crisis was really important, and also trying to think about, like, how does one approach the study of finance, especially when one of the kind of core features of finance is to launder interest, income, rents, and so forth of the specific characteristics of a place in time. And so racial capitalism became also a method, a way of making sense of what some would describe as financialization, the varieties and overlapping forms of indebtedness. So racial capitalism was an important way of kind of making sense of really kind of squaring the two narratives between a post-racial America and also this subprime mortgage crisis. Another moment for me came in 2015, 2016. This is, I had moved to New York and was a member of the Black Youth Project, BYP 100, part of this kind of constellation of the movement for Black lives. And I remember reading the Agenda to Build Black Futures, a short pamphlet that tried to kind of make the case for what does Black futures look like, what are the various problems and solutions. And racial capitalism was being deployed left and right throughout that document, and also in conversations about the Agenda to Build Black Futures. And so clearly this concept at that point had sort of moved from the reading groups that I was a part of as a graduate student, and also the kind of the seminars that I participated in as an undergraduate, and had now been was now being deployed in organizing spaces. And so that then pushed me to sort of try to offer some more analytical heft, and to think about how racial capitalism can be both a method, but also has a particular history to it, and seeing how the method and the various histories, again, histories plural, can then inform organizing practices in the context of the movement for Black lives. So 2008 and 2016 were really big moments for me.
I think that's really interesting, because one of the ideas that I'm coming up with recently, a lot of academic research can be very theory driven and just reproducing the theory almost in oblivion to the empirical evidence. And it's like when we increasingly look for new sources of empirical evidence and asking ourselves how well they fit with established theories. And when you say racial capitalism can be used as a method, what could you explain what you actually mean by that? I know that's not following the questions we agreed on, but I think it's an important part of the point you make in the book. So what does that mean as a method as well as a conceptual framework?
Yeah, a great follow-up question. I mean, I think I have a chapter in the volume that really tries to think about the development of the New South and tries to historicize the municipal bond market, basically how the New South is going to try to deal with the ghosts of the past, the violation of a debtor-creditor arrangement through debt repudiations 50 years after the fact, and try to mobilize capital to stimulate development. But there's a way in which the whole genre of finance, bond finance, yield, par values is kind of, again, laundered of its racial dynamics. So you have people trying to raise capital without explicitly referencing Jim Crow, the sort of brutal system of racial apartheid and violence that arguably was the basis for economic security for various debts. And so when you approach the financial press, again, there's a sort of laundering of the specificity of the racial violence on which a bond is partially backed. And so racial capitalism as a method allows us to sort of take matters of debt, engage with the financial press, again, that seemingly have nothing to do with race, and say, actually, we can not only think about par value and also Jim Crow, and see how the two are entangled, and see how racial domination and hierarchy actually gets deployed to raise capital and becomes, again, the basis for security. So that's what I mean by racial capitalism as a method, in terms of like approaching various sources which would seem to have nothing to do with race. It helps us see those connections, and then that becomes part of the histories that we try to tell. The method allows us to see the histories in various settings, and kind of to Justin's point, thinking about like it allows us to sort of read or argue against the idea of a post-racial America. Of course, that is a myth that has been thoroughly punctured, if not before the racial revanchism of Trumpism. But that was a dominant current. And so racial capitalism as a method allows us to see exactly how, you know, the subprime mortgage crisis is a racialized crisis. And again, to kind of give the lie to this being a kind of post-racial America, and or arguments that would see race as an externality, as an overflow of some more fundamental dynamic.
Yeah, and another thing I'll add, I definitely agree with Destin that racial capitalism is a method for seeing the operation of race when there appears to be none. But I think it also, you know, a method is about your approach to your sources or your archives. And I think thinking about racial capitalism as a method allows us to really upend some of the common sense narratives we might bring to those documents. So, you know, I have written a little bit about insurance in relationship to race. And if we think about kind of how finance and other dynamics of capitalism sort of produce capital, extract value from Black people or other groups as the kind of core concept we're looking at, then all of a sudden we're not kind of looking at a straightforward history of racial progress, but we're looking at a changing history of how capitalism generates capital through exploiting racial difference, right? And so in that piece, I look at social impact bonds, which are a very kind of bizarre niche aspect of the bond market. But you know, you see this also in things like extending credit to, you know, the so-called bottom billion in the global South, or, you know, financial literacy in indigenous communities, right? It has this kind of patina of inclusion, progress, sort of rectifying inequality, but really it's, to use Kienga Yamada-Taylor's term, a form of predatory inclusion that offers capital more ways of kind of you know, generating wealth through these racial dynamics.
And Jackie, just to follow up, so your original question kind of about the genesis, I mean, it's clear just based off of what I've said and what Justin has offered that we're very much influenced by the so-called financial turn, right? To think about the history of capitalism, not just by centering in on wage labor, but also to think about financial flows, matters of credit, debt, social impact bonds, municipal bonds, various kinds of financial instruments. So very much influenced by the financial turn and the importance of finance to modern capitalism. And so there's that. But and I would also add, though, at the same time, right, especially in the edited volume, the work of Shauna Sweeney and others who think about kind of the importance of reproduction, right, bringing that to bear on the study of history, or incorporating that as part of any study of racial capitalism, to think about the speculations on the womb of an enslaved Black woman, thinking about intergenerational wealth by way of speculation, which of course gets us in the direction of finance, but also very much hinges on reproduction. So in that sense, we're kind of building off of the work that had been done well before 2008, well before the financial crisis, to think about reproduction. So there are archival implications of engaging with racial capitalism, again, methods and how one approaches the sources, historiographical implications in terms of what are the major turning points in capitalism. So for instance, one question I've thought a great deal about is, clearly the Great Depression in the 1930s is identified as a signal moment in the history of capitalism, at least during the 20th century. To what extent is it a racial crisis, right? Is the Great Depression a crisis in racial capitalism? That's up for debate. I mean, so it forces us to think about key turning points as we start to chart out this broader history of capitalism or racial capitalism. And then, of course, there are implications for organizing. This is the kind of go back to the point, Jackie, you raised about, just sort of what's the utility of theory beyond the classroom, beyond these high-level discussions. And in some sense, this is related, but it's a little distinct. Cedric Robinson, of course, is the key formulator of racial capitalism in his Black Marxism. But there's also another proposition he gives us, and it relates to organizing. He says that, quote, Marxism and Black radicalism, two programs for revolutionary change, is a particular and critically different realization of history. Indeed, they may be so distinct as to be incommensurable. At issue here is whether this is so. If it is, judgments must be made, choices taken. Okay, so you kind of think about that proposition and how it relates to racial capitalism. It opens up different questions around alliances, theories of change, ways of base building, and clearly just thinking about the movement for Black Lives and BYP 100 in particular, trying to think about racial capitalism, beginning with an analysis of racial capitalism opens up questions around alliances, centering different kinds of subjects, subjective experiences in order to try to actualize some sort of vision of change. So in that sense, again, the sort of their implications here for archives, historiography, and also for organizing.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful because there's so much work that has been done and needs to be done around issues of racism. But it's also really helpful just to say, what is your particular contribution? Because you can't do, there's too much to be done. And it's good to have a focus of what is it that your work is actually contributing here. And I think you've really explained that really well. Of one or two ideas, I'm not going to pick them up now, but I think they've come out of this first part, is these issues around method and concept. And I think you find that very much in the debates around intersectionality. So whereas in some earlier versions of that concept, it was very much about empowerment and radical change, some of the subsequent debates have said it's become a method, and the empowerment part or the social change part has diminished as people have just said, let's count up how many bits of intersectional inequalities we have. But should we leave that to talk about with a wider audience later? Because I think the interaction between method and concept and its relevance for social change is really important. But let's move on to talk about how did you come to write the book? So one bright day, you're sitting in a bar and say, hey, we need to do this book. Because I've had moments like that a long, long time ago. So tell us, how did you get to do this?
I guess I'll, I think I can give you guys a kind of, I won't bore you with the kind of, relationships with the press and back and forth and, and so on. I think the thing I will highlight is thinking about historians or scholars as historical subjects, right, to sort of situate me and Justin within our particular context. So it is, I don't think this project, it certainly wouldn't have been released as quickly as it did, especially given an edited volume, if not for many of the earlier conversations. The fact that, for instance, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, I helped start a workshop called Approaches to Capitalism. It was there that we invited, for instance, Alan Lumba, Justin Leroy, and that was around 2013, 2014. So even though the book kind of really, we all kind of put pen to pad, decided on the final roster of contributors probably around 2018, the conversations predate that. And we had actually been in seminars talking about our respective research projects and how we were approaching racial capitalism and why it mattered. In some sense, it was kind of like, I would say many of the contributors came together, and Justin, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but we kind of came together first in recognizing, one, the limits of the post-racial myth and trying to make sense of the predicaments of our family members in our communities. And also as a kind of counter response to what was described at the time as the new history of capitalism and its various citational practices, the sense that to the extent that race mattered in the history of capitalism, it only mattered in the context of slavery. And once you have the formal end of slavery, thus you have the end of the sort of racial dynamics of capitalism, even if, that was rarely acknowledged by many of the practitioners. And the kind of reification of the older kind of base superstructure overflow stuff, which I've already mentioned. And so we kind of came together in somewhat, and not quite in opposition, because I cut my teeth on a lot of that stuff and was very much informed and influenced by the work of my colleagues who wrote under the banner of the new history of capitalism. But in some sense, recognizing that there was a limit, there was a problem in that literature, and not griping about it, but actually saying, well, what is that problem and what is our contribution? There's so many ways, so often we can sort of critique something, but not actually respond or actualize or act on, I should say, on our critiques. And so that was what we did for years, actually, in seminar rooms. And then we had a seminar series at Harvard, then the following year at the University of Chicago. And so, long story short, we had built up a rapport over many years at that point, had seen projects develop over a long period of time. And then finally, we were able to kind of formalize it and put out the volume.
Yeah, and I think one of the really fascinating things about the process is how how the collaboration shaped our thinking as editors. I mean, the question of definitions and kind of who is willing to define capitalism and who kind of is resistant to that is a big part of the external critique of new scholarship on capitalism. But we knew that we wanted to kind of provide readers with some kind of working definition, right? Not the only definition, but a solid, a solid one, particularly because there seemed to be a lot of confusion as to what racial capitalism was. But that's not something I think we would have been able to do effectively just kind of from the start, right? It was sort of by talking about these very specific projects from such a wide range of contributors that we kind of thought through how we needed to frame the concept of racial capitalism. And I think in that sense, it was kind of figuring out how to define it from the ground up rather than having a kind of grand theory of race and capitalism that we put together. And for example, my own work is primarily on slavery and emancipation, but that's only one small fraction of racial capitalism. And as Destin just said, it's the aspect of racial capitalism that in the past 5 or 10 years is actually getting a lot of more mainstream acknowledgement, right? There are, there are some kind of quibbles over whether or not Atlantic slavery was capitalist, but it's generally accepted as a plausible claim, even if maybe at the end of the day you don't agree with it. But we kind of frame racial capitalism in these three ways, which is kind of exploitation of labor, right, or dispossession. So the stuff that falls under the rubric of slavery. But there's also, the question of exclusion and containment that we kind of got from 20th century scholars and sort of scholars of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. We kind of had to think about inclusion and how kind of inclusion within the mechanisms of capitalism, particularly when it comes to credit and housing and insurance, were also part of the dynamics of racial capitalism. And so the kind of breadth of the contributions challenged us to kind of have a definition or framing of this analytic that was both coherent, but also could kind of capture all of the different kind of regional and temporal and kind of other forms of distinction in terms of the contributions. And I think in that sense, doing an edited volume was much more helpful for me, at least, in thinking through the problem of racial capitalism than doing a sole authored book or article.
Completely agree. I would also add, part of this is, hopefully this comes through from reading the introduction, is I think one needs to have a little bit of humility when we approach the study, whatever we're studying. So in the sense, right, like, it was never our intention to come up with a definition once and for all of racial capitalism that works, or a theory that works to explain the relationship between race broadly conceived and matters of capital. That was never our intention. And indeed, we say at the very end of the introduction, I mean, the extent to which racial capitalism is portable, is analytically flexible and encompassing enough to make sense of very different dynamics at different moments in time, is an open question. It's supposed to be a provocation, as Ryan Jobson, one of the contributors to the collection, notes. It's most useful not when we treat it as a sort of ossified heuristic, ossified theory of the world, and more useful when we treat it as a provocation, as perhaps a starting point of one of many starting points to approach the archive, to approach organizing, historiography, and so on. And I think so yes, and I think one of the things I'm most proud about the volume is how it, of course, it recognizes the centrality of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, but it also tries to think about how, for lack of a better term, a racial subaltern in the context of Hawaii or the Philippines or indigenous North America during the 18th century or late 17th and early 18th centuries features into, is constitutive of, is core to the development of reproductions of racial capitalism from that point onward and into the 20th century. So, and that was the point, to sort of say, like, here's a provocation. It's up to folks to then deploy it in the context of, say, Japanese invasion of China during the late 1930s, right? To what extent is that useful? What about, I had a student raise the question, how useful is racial capitalism in making sense of sort of ethnic conflict and state building practices in East Africa? I mean, that's the question that we want people to ask. And it was not our intention to come up with some bulletproof theory. That wasn't our investment. I mean, I think also Justin gave kind of three definitions or points that are constitutive of our definition. Again, exploitation, containment, and also inclusion. And I think it's also interesting to ask, like, to whom do we turn to study or look for critiques of racial capitalism, even if they didn't necessarily use the language or framework of racial capitalism? And I think it's really interesting. Like, you could, of course, have, various radicals. I mean, maybe you could have somebody like Claudia Jones or somebody else who, you might think has their finger on the pulse when they think about the Bronx slave market, for instance, in thinking about domestic workers and how they're being exploited, Black domestic workers being exploited in the context of the 1930s, the Great Depression. Okay, that might be one person to whom you turn to think about, like, how is racial capitalism? What does it look like during the Great Depression? I've been particularly intrigued by the critiques of racial capitalism by so-called liberals, Black liberals working for, say, the NAACP or the Congress on Racial Equality, the same folks who recognize the links between racial differentiation and hierarchy, for instance, and matters of finance in continuing to finance segregated schools in the Jim Crow South. So even though they didn't act on the kind of political implications of a critique of race and finance, race and capitalism, they still nevertheless had an analysis of how racial hierarchy was being furthered, how Jim Crow in particular, this regime was being furthered despite Brown v. Board in 1954, despite some of the other changes in civil rights legislation. And so sometimes it's the people you expect, sometimes it's the people you expect, sometimes it's folks who you expect the least, what am I trying to say? Sometimes it's people you don't expect to have their finger on the pulse, and who themselves are being incorporated slowly into racial capitalism, who are levying a critique, even if they don't always act on the political implications of their analysis. And so that's also just a point about archive method and how we approach the sources, who we look for kind of articulators and people who understood the links between race and capitalism.
I think that's enormously helpful for a number of reasons. I wanted to ask you about it, because I think one of the, first of all, understanding the key components that you've used from bringing in empirical research to inform how you build elements of a concept and how they are linked together rather than siloed types of projects. I think also what I wanted to ask you is also for younger scholars who are engaged like you have been. I mean, a long time ago, I remember 30 years ago when I had a similar types of ideas and discussions with my friends, like saying, why don't Black women work part-time and white women do? And part-time work's meant to be terrible exploitation of women. So why are Black women working full-time when women are meant to be liberated by working full-time? So it was asking these questions, and we led to writing a book, not as successful as yours, but it was a book that came out of that young, energetic desire to, like, why doesn't that fit the theory? So I think this is a really important contribution, and also showing how creating your communities of discourse with people who are working in parallel or somewhat related areas, just drawing on why are they doing it like that. I think you've shown how rich it is what you've produced. I think that's really helpful. The very last question I'm going to ask, and I want to open it up to the floor so that other people have a chance to ask questions and join in the debate. Where do we take this then? Where would you like this concept to go, or what would you like to do next? How do we apply it? What are you guys doing? What do you think other people should be doing? What do you think, for example, members of our community at Sussex who haven't been talking about this before, what should we be doing? So there's a lot of questions in there, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat or just put up your hand and I'll call upon you.
Well, I know we're waiting, very much excited about Justin's forthcoming book. Is it still The Lowest Freedom?
We kind of gestured toward this a little bit, but both Destin and I are trained as U.S. historians. I think it's clear that many of these same dynamics are very applicable to the British context through the history of the slave trade and also the history of empire. But I get excited thinking about what we have to learn from scholars in very different areas who are engaging with these ideas. So Andrew Liu has a great book on India and China. The title's escaping me, but I'm sure we can put it in the chat. And he, deeply, it's a deeply theoretical and also deeply archival book. Kind of some of the questions that Destin raised, when we go to other parts of the globe, do these forms of difference that are central to capital accumulation, do we want to call those forms of difference race? And, do they fit into this rubric of racial capitalism? I think one of the problems we have is thinking of race as this very self-evident thing, and I don't think it is. You could certainly argue that race is defined as a form of difference that emerges under capitalism. And that's not just something that happens in a US or North Atlantic context. In a European context outside of Britain and France and these kind of big players in the slave trade, I think there's certainly open questions about how racial capitalism fits into those kind of regional and national histories of capitalism.
Yeah, I think for me, there are two sort of avenues or directions. The first is just because I had just a terrific conversation with an up-and-coming brilliant scholar, Hazim Hardiman, a graduate student at Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, who is interested in not just sort of racial capitalism from a political economic standpoint, and thinking about the so-called Rust Belt in the Northeast, but also how it relates to rituals, right? And other so-called externalities. How do people make sense and process not just matters of capital accumulation, who's being unemployed, who can find work, who can't, how people make sense of grieving, of loss through rituals, and how that relates to the sort of the dynamics or the nexus between race and capital. So interested in would we code that the social or the ideological? I mean, there's that question, but also just how folks are thinking about, okay, once we have, if you're convinced by the links between racial differentiation and credit flows and so on, how do people live through that, make sense of it, even if they don't always organize against it, which is also a kind of, sometimes some of the historical research could go in that direction, given the problem of racial capitalism structure, right? How do people within try to contest? But it's not always necessarily contesting the terms of inclusion, the terms of exclusion, or the terms of containment. There are other ways in which people then relate to the dynamics of racial capitalism, and just curious to see what are those other ways. I think the second kind of avenue or direction that I'd be really excited to engage with and follow up on is around racial capitalism and matters of public finance. I mean, I think there's a way in which, again, the financial turn has largely meant accumulation through the circulation of various financial instruments. But what does the framework of racial capitalism do for matters of state expenditures, government revenues, not just debt, but also administration, right? In other words, sure, you could think about public finance as having something to do with accumulation, right? Sort of establishing the parameters in which private accumulation can occur, but that's not the only rationale. And so what does racial capitalism do as a framework for thinking about state public finance from sort of state level? This is the great work of David Stein, who's thinking about racial capitalism as a framework to approach the study of the Federal Reserve, for instance, in the United States, but also what racial capitalism does for other kind of political subdivisions of the broader national state. And so really interested in that. Again, that's not just about accumulation and setting up the parameters for accumulation, but it relates to other things about balancing the purse and raising revenues along extractive lines or progressive lines, which I think is also an important political front, right? Which is something that the movement for Black Lives has tried to think a great deal about, especially when you think about divest and invest, right? The whole framework around pulling outsized expenditures for policing and investing in the kinds of services that'll help people stay safe. That's about public finance, right? And I think bringing racial capitalism as a framework to bear on that is an important area of study.
Great. I have got loads more questions, but I'm not going to ask them, so that I can make sure that anybody from the audience would like to just either raise your hand, or if you had some question in the chat. And it can be, please, it can be anything you want to ask about the book or the ideas that have been discussed so far. So you're very welcome. You might feel a bit formal, but while we might wait for one or two people to think about what it is they'd like to say. I mean, one of the things for me, I think, a takeaway from this is I actually think it's important that it does look at capitalism in terms of what are the racial implications of the way various forms of accumulation are created. In the same way that it may seem kind of obvious to you now, but back in the 80s or the mid 80s when I started my PhD, working in areas around employment, industrial relations, it was just the male white worker was the focus of attention. And you were terribly radical if you were studying women workers or tried to, I once said to a very eminent and very nice industrial sociologist, you study homeless men. And he went, no, I don't. What do you mean by that? Because obviously these are very low status people, whereas he thought he was studying the aristocracy of labor, which in that case would be IG Metall, the biggest German trade union. And when I said you study homeless men, and I said, because you never look at what happens to them when they go home. Who do they live with? Who supports them? Who reproduces their labor? What happens to the women often that they live with? And so he suddenly discovered women about the late 1980s. So I said, congratulations. And now it's taken for granted that you can't not talk about men and women in the labor market. But I think what you're doing is making people more aware that you can't ignore race. Right, Eric, would you like to turn on your mic, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and say what you'd like to say?
Thanks for making space. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, fire ahead.
Great.
Can you just introduce yourself for those of us who don't know you?
I am not a scholar. I am just a regular person and interested in some of the intersections here. And I just wanted to ask a question to the panelists here, picking up on something that was just said moments ago around kind of intersections with the movement space. Because to me, I'm curious how y'all are intentionalizing the connections to the broader movement organizations, both nationally at the local level. Particularly, I'm here in Buffalo, New York, and I heard a mention to the Northeast, the Rust Belt of the Northeast. I'm in the middle of it, and the reason why I'm asking the connections to movement organizations, given the learnings that you're sharing through your work, both in the book and more broadly through your research, is because I feel like movement organizations across scale have slightly underdeveloped formulations of these intersections in ways that I think might actually be hindering the development of a broader politics that could support more progressive notions of public finance, for example, as was noted moments ago, or even more kind of sustainable exercises in moving towards like political agenda setting across the scale from the federal to the local level. So I just wanted to lift that up as a question, because for me, it's great to have this conversation in this forum and hear what y'all are thinking. I think the real value is making those connections into the sort of broader public arena.
You guys want to reply?
Yeah,
Eric, Eric, can I just say thank you very much, because that happens to be one of the themes of the conference about activism. So brilliant, spot on. Fire ahead, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think you're right that it's central. I mean, Destin mentioned some of his organizing background. I frequently get asked to talk about racial capitalism, actually probably more by political organizations and kind of grassroots spaces than academic spaces. As someone who doesn't identify as an organizer, I don't want to kind of presume to be telling you what to do, but I think I will sort of say, just anecdotally, I actually, both Destin and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, And it's, if you're not familiar with Northern California, it's this bizarre place that has a reputation for being very liberal. And in terms of many social issues, it is, but also the inequality, the economic inequality is, I mean, just so beyond stunning. You absolutely wouldn't believe it unless you kind of experienced it and kind of were just observed it. And so it's a really great case study of how kind of victories that kind of sort of get, eliminate the sort of social or psychic or personal basis for racial inequality doesn't produce, it doesn't even, it barely produces a slightly more just society. It produces a society where everyone thinks they're anti-racist, and the economic inequality is, off the charts. You have people in the richest state of the richest country in the world that has, these the highest rates of homelessness, right? There's something in that dynamic that I would argue cannot be explained out without using a framework like racial capitalism. And I think racial capitalism kind of helps us see the limitations of some of the kind of compromise goals, right? There's ways that just because you I guess I'll just say what you're organizing for isn't always self-evident. And I think kind of separating out the kind of economic policy improvements or racial policy improvements can oftentimes be self-defeating in a long-term sense.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, Eric. First, thank you for the question. So I think that if racial capitalism is a problem, then the question becomes, what are its pressure points? What are the things on which to push? Who is an ally? Which political block with institutional power and might do you need to move? I mean, obviously, this is a reflection of my own theory of change. And there are different theories of change animating movement work. But who is a segment that you need to push, and how, through what means, in order to deal with the problem of racial capitalism? And so I'll just kind of say, like, so that's how what I take away from your question. I will also say it's very interesting, me having written also a book on municipal bond finance. I've been in conversation with many folks from the financial world who want to do something, who recognize a problem. But the next question is like, what is the nature of the problem? And so part of what they do is they say, well, the problem is, we just need to support Black businesses. Okay, that's one model, but I think that relates to still the racial capitalism as absorption and inclusion without disrupting the other expressions of exploitation and containment and exclusion. But all that is to say, this is a segment with, and this is kind of, again, reflecting my own theory of change, that you actually do need to partially move the owners of capital in some kind of way. And so what do you do with folks who, on the one hand, have unique levers of power on which to pull, who recognize a problem but don't define the problem as racial capitalism, but define the problem in terms of inclusion? We just need to create more opportunities, in other words. And so does one form an alliance with those people, given their unique access to power, the unique levers on which they can pull to try to check a kind of racist authoritarian fascism, which I do think is distinct from the sort of liberal varieties and approaches to racial capitalism? Do you form that alliance? Or do you say that actually that is an alliance that might be useful, but it would deepen the power of finance, which would come to dominate our own communities in the long run? I mean, and so, part of these are the big questions that I think, I've been involved in, and I've thought a lot about as I talk to some of these folks. And I think, the short and sweet is I'm just not a purist. Like, I think in terms of tactics and strategies, and there are ways in which you can mobilize folks in the short term to check some of the other threats, even as you also try to organize a long-term vision to undermine the particular segments with which you're partnered. And at the same time, I think the short answer is that I don't know anybody who's figured this stuff out. Like, I don't know who this is, especially when you think about the ecological crises, when you think about the other dynamics and threats that we face. I do think there has to be an all-in approach, even as we are clear about what our principles are, theories of change, and recognize there may be some clashes, but I do think that that the issue is, what I find is not that people don't have an awareness of public finance or municipal finance or financial capitalism, late stage capitalism. It's the other question around, what do we do about the dilemmas of the particular alliances with which we can people we can build with, and does it sort of deepen our predicaments around the corner or in the long term?
Thanks. I think that's really helpful. Eric, does that answer some of your questions, or it's something to follow up on another time? Because we've only got 10 minutes left. I've got 5 minutes left. And I've got 2 more questions. Cool. Right.
Yeah, I think I would love to talk more about it maybe offline, perhaps. I think there's a lot to say, as I'm sure we all know. But I think the crux of my question was around intentionalizing the connections of the ideas in this work into a more explicit and more perhaps well-developed notion of communicative infrastructure that turns into organizing supports for folks in these various frontline spaces that were just mentioned, whether in the Bay or in the Northeast or in other places that are kind of catalytic points of movement, emergent movement building work.
Well, you might be interested, which I'm going to promote at the end. We've got some activists, young Black women activists, coming to the conference in Amsterdam who've got plenty of ideas of things to be done, of which there are many. So it's not a conversation that will be solved today, but let's carry on the conversation. I also want to mention one brief thing from a work from Nancy Di Tommaso, who was at a session we had 2 weeks ago. And one of the points she made related to what you're saying here is the non-dilemma. And we were talking about the rise of the radical right in America. One of the things she was saying, what you just said, really, Justin, in liberal communities, whereas as Hillary Clinton named all that rabble that vote for Trump as kind of stupid people that are racists, white middle class people aren't racists. They just happen to look after their own, which helps promote their children through their networks of particular types of elites. But that's not called racism, and it's not a problem. But effectively, it reproduces structural inequalities, was one of the points she's making in that really important book she's written. But let me go, Ruiz, you've got a question here, and I'll take one question as well from Marilyn. So Ruiz, would you like to introduce yourself? Because it kind of follows on from that about racial and structural racism, racial capitalism. Luis, do you want to introduce yourself, or would you?
Hello, good afternoon.
Would you like to say where you're from?
I'm from Portugal, and but I'm living in Germany, in the south from Germany, close to Stuttgart. I'm going to put my camera because I'm with my handy, my mobile. I don't know if it will work. Okay.
No problem. Fire ahead.
Okay. My question is just because I have background with the colonialism, because my ancestors was in the colonial time in Africa. They have some powers, but my question is the relationship between the theory about race capitalism with imperialism, and if they could also expand more about inequality, social justice, if there is some relationship about them or not. Okay, if there is some relationship, because I'm sometimes not very clear about the relationship between race capitalism with social justice, if there is some empathy or not, and about inequality also, because I think racial capitalism can be in variety of the models from everyday life, like poverty in the house, to rent house, or in the labor market also. But if they could expand a little more about this relationship.
Okay. Thank you, Ruiz, for your question. Destin has got a hard stop daddy duties to attend to, so you might have to leave us, or unless you want to have a quick
No. I just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity, but more soon. Justin is well equipped to hold it down. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming. We really enjoyed it. So over to you, Justin. You're going to answer that really challenging question, and then we have a question from quite a lot of a question from Marilyn. And right, first of all, that one, Justin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. So we talk about this history a little bit in the book, but the language of racial capitalism came from the South African context in the 1970s, and sort of inspired by those activists who he met in the UK. The political scientist Cedric Robinson kind of used the term racial capitalism as a general theory of capitalism, kind of broadening it from the South African context. And he mostly writes about histories of slavery in that book. And so one of our goals was to kind of bring the question of colonialism and imperialism to bear on racial capitalism. And so we kind of Destin and I in our introduction largely do this by thinking about kind of indigeneity and kind of colonialism and native dispossession in North America, and arguably broadly as a fundamental form of racial capitalism that historically operated alongside slavery. But part of what racial capitalism does is to say that later forms of 18th and 19th century imperialism and into the 20th century and kind of post-colonialism, it's not just about kind of economic exploitation. It's the economic project of imperialism is deeply related to its racializing project. And so I think racial capitalism is a pretty easy fit with studies of empire. The other question, I think the relationship of racial capitalism to social justice depends on your definition of social justice, right? In some contexts, political rights are, of such supreme importance and are the main goal of, political struggles, that social justice kind of becomes coterminous with the expansion and extension of rights. So in those contexts, racial capitalism maybe doesn't seem to have the most straightforward relationship. But to kind of loop all the way back around to something Jackie said at the beginning about intersectionality, if you look at the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was a Black feminist organization in the 1970s that originated the term or the concept intersectionality, they were talking about the intersecting identities of race, gender, and sexuality, but they framed that all within being sort of subjects of capitalism and the kind of economic inequality that was deeply related to these other identities. And I think that's sort of how I would answer the question, right? A kind of broad, one might say intersectional understanding of social justice does, I think, recognize how, the inequality of these various identities has a material basis in the dynamics of capitalism. And I see Marilyn's question here. I can just jump.
Should we let Marilyn? Marilyn, do you want to introduce yourself? Just because it's nice to have Marilyn. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself, who you are, and frame the question for the people who may not have seen it in the chat briefly?
I am in Arlington, Texas, between Dallas and Fort Worth. I'm a licensed psychologist in private practice, and also I'm involved in some groups seeking racial justice. But my question was asking you to expand on what you told us about the components of racial capitalism, of exploitation, exclusion, and inclusion, exploitation of labor, slavery. But what other things do these things include, the three components you mentioned?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So we go into this in more detail in the introduction, which I think is available and we sent to you all. But I'm more than happy to follow up with you and send that to you if you don't have access to it. But just kind of briefly, the idea of exploitation is, I think, the easiest to wrap our heads around, right? There's kind of the most explicit forms like, like enslavement, like, Native people being forced off their land. But there's also kind of, later forms of exploitation like sharecropping. It could be a racial differentiation in labor. It's, I would say the kind of the ways that race kind of exploits or extracts value from racialized people, different racial groups. The kind of exclusion containment question is also, I think, one where we can think of examples. So, right, excluding Black people or people of other races from employment opportunities, like banking, credit, that sort of excluding them from economic opportunity is what we mean there. But also kind of what you do with that excluded population, right? So things like incarceration, right? Making sure that excluded population isn't a threat to the kind of everyday workings of capitalism. And then I think the last one is the trickiest because, how could inclusion be bad? Why would we want to critique inclusion? And I think to some extent that's true, right? Kind of being broadly included within the structures and dynamics of capitalism can absolutely offer benefits to individuals or families or even entire communities. And we don't mean to deny that or take away from it. But we also want to be careful and look at the ways that those forms of exclusion can sometimes reinforce inequality, right? So I just reviewed this excellent manuscript about landlords who set the buildings they owned on fire in the Bronx in the 1970s, kind of making residents homeless and collecting on these insurance policies. And the reason that they were able to do that is because of a shift in the US insurance market, right? So places like the Bronx, urban areas where, there had been white flight, where the tax base had fled, for a long time were considered sort of too risky to be insured, right? An insurance company didn't want to touch those places. But as a result of a policy change that was meant to be inclusive to kind of give residents of those places access to insurance policies, to kind of include them in this form of finance, it allowed these landlords who were not Black or Latino to take insurance policies on the buildings they owned and rented to Black and Latino residents, and then commit arson and collect on the insurance policies. So something that in theory should have been good and inclusive actually sort of provided the mechanism for further impoverishment and immiseration of the residents of those communities. And so when we say that the third aspect of racial capitalism is that form of inclusion, we don't mean that inclusion is always bad and that we should pretend that we're going to somehow live always in opposition to all of these dynamics of capitalism, but more just that we should turn a critical eye to those forms of inclusion, to see if there are unintended consequences. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Marilyn, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, as we can have a conversation here rather than strap you tightly?
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you so much, Justin. That's very helpful.
Welcome.
And I will go back and read your introduction. I apologize.
No, I absolutely didn't mean that as a critique. More just to sort of to say that there's more information there than I could kind of go over just in a few minutes here.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I hope it's not too hot in Texas.
It's too hot, but thank you for your thoughts.
Justin and Destin, thank you. Well, thank you so much for, I think, what's been a fantastic session. It's better than I could have hoped for. I hope loads of people go and buy the book. Nice summer reading. And Justin, would you like to have the last word?
Well, I just want to thank you and Jacob and everyone in the audience for joining us and for the questions. It's always really wonderful to have a chance to talk about the book. So thank you again. Congratulations, well done. And thank you everybody for coming and asking really interesting questions. So thank you very much everybody for attending. And I hope to see you somewhere sometime, somewhere soon, online or in person. Thanks everyone. Thank you very much.